Okay. Welcome back, folks. I didn't see that much scribbling going on in the break, which is understandable. But now that we're all recaffeinated, during the plenary, please do jot down any talking points for the round table. It's my pleasure and delight to introduce John Edwards. John is a British by birth, but spent most of his life in Canada. Little known fact, even among many Celtic linguists, that Nova Scotia, where John is based, at the turn of the 20th century, had more speakers of Gaelic than the Highlands and Islands in Scotland. So it's an interesting, important link there. My point being that although John has a very panoramic understanding of minority language issues, there's also an important Celtic connection relevant to today. We've been very lucky to have John doing a number of different talks around around the country this week. Short and sweet, right?
Absolutely.
I first got to know John because he was editing the Journal of Multilingual and Multicultural Development, a fine journal, which used to be housed in Multilingual Matters, but then Routledge's insatiable appetite for journals saw it gobbled up. Nevertheless, he's still editing the journal, also editing the Multilingual Matters series, which is still run by Multilingual Matters. That would be a bit weird if that wasn't run by Multilingual Matters. He's also a fellow of the British Psychological Society and the Canadian Psychological Association, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. And I think that's about embarrassing enough. So, one other thing. John is contractually obliged to advertise the fact that he has just joined Dalhousie University, as well as his headline for St Francis Xavier University affiliation. Just joined the graduate school of Dalhousie University in Halifax. Over to you, John.
Good, thanks. Well, of course, I'm not contractually obliged to mention it, but they do like me to mention it now. So, well, I'm delighted to be here. There are a couple of things I wanted to say. One of the advantages of coming at the end is you get to listen to everybody else, and then you can sometimes scribble out whole pages of your thing, say, no, that was wrong, or more likely you add to things, little snippets of information and so on. And I found lots of things interesting today, goes without saying, but a couple of things that I didn't ask, a question about myself at the time, but I thought it's worth mentioning. In the talk by the nurses and about, using Welsh to communicate with an elderly lady, wasn't it? Something like that, yeah. I had a couple of thoughts. One is, in centuries ago when I actually studied neurolinguistics, I realized what a complicated affair speech production, and recognition, and reproduction was. And I know just how complicated it is. And at a personal level, I had a nice example, not a million miles away from the one you gave, but with an interesting little twist of just how complicated things are. Excuse me, my mother-in-law, who has since died, was a native French speaker, and she had a stroke, like the patient you mentioned, I think. She had a stroke. And she was on a ward in the state of Vermont, actually, in America, the state, some of you may or may not know, just sort of south of Quebec, so there was that. Anyway, she, like a lot of stroke patients, you could sense that sort of frustration and they were trying to get her to speak and so on. And finally, one of the Francophone nurses on the ward thought to herself, well, this old lady's first language was French, maybe, who knows, it'll open up some conduit or something like that. So she did. So she spoke to my mother-in-law in French, and the old lady answered. It was magic, really, but in English. Yeah, I mean, you never know what you're going to get. I mean, it's true then, she did start, I think over the next few days or a week or something, to sort of say things in French, but it was mostly like the prayers she'd learned as a little girl. It was sort of rote stuff. And I mean, you probably know better than I. You get all sorts of somebody who's trilingual, let's say, falls over and bumps their head, and they regain their languages, but in the reverse order. I mean, it seems like everything is possible. So I thought that was interesting. The more general comment I had was sort of to congratulate. I always take the opportunity to congratulate nurses on their work, because apart from all the professional training as health professionals, it's always struck me that even within the same language community, one of the many things that nurses do, and usually do very well, is act as linguistic brokers. Isn't that so? I mean, shuttling between doctors and patients, sort of taking what the doctors say and translating it. I mean, you touched on this, or somebody did, when they said, there's all this highfalutin thing, but the patient just wants to know, is my shoulder going to be better? And that's quite a skill, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of sensitivity there that has to be wrapped up with professionalism. And then in the talk that we had after that, you were talking about, rights to Welsh and so on, and that's very much in line with what I wanted to talk to you about today. Questions of language rights. But the right to Welsh, insofar as it exists, let's say, in courts, of course, it's a right that you find in other courts around the world. It's a fairly common and obvious one, at least for national minority groups and so on. A bit trickier sometimes for immigrant groups. That's exactly the sort of right that qualifies, as far as I can see, as a right. Because a right, as I shall be trying to elaborate, is only a right when it has teeth. Otherwise, it's something else, and I'll tell you what I think it is in just a minute. But I was, of course, aware that this day was largely about discussions of language in the workplace. Although I noticed it's ranged very nicely and quite widely over other aspects of the public arena, including the legal and the medical, of course, and the educational. But one of the things, not the only thing, but one of the things that underpins discussions of language in these arenas is, of course, the question of rights. What rights do people have? What rights ought they to have? What rights, in some cases, have they been denied? And a further twist, which I'll get back to a little bit later on, is the question of whether rights should inhere in individuals, which is the sort of classic historical liberal interpretation of human rights, or whether a case can be made, as is increasingly being made, for rights to attach to people by virtue of their being members of particular groups. Or to put it very bluntly, individual rights versus group rights. A very contested, but of course a very interesting area for that very reason. So here I want to just discuss some of the most salient issues, thinking that it might provide some sort of general background to some of the more specifics that we've heard about today, and maybe introduce a couple of little twists that perhaps some of you hadn't thought of up to now. But of all the salient issues, the one that is the most important, the point that I want most to clarify in this paper, is that claims, that's the word I was leading up to a minute ago, claims are not the same thing as rights. And the problem is that many current treatments of language rights are essentially moral cases. They're moral cases that hide, sometimes through ignorance, but sometimes I really think through intention, a lack of legal or official underpinnings. In other words, things are presented as rights. Indeed, that relevant corner of the literature is full of papers about language rights of all sorts of groups in all sorts of contexts. But they tend perhaps rather to be a little bit hollow. Of course, I mean, I have to make a number of sort of side statements as I go along here, and the one that occurs to me here is just to point out that, of course, there's nothing at all wrong with making arguments based on shared principle or indeed preferences or desires, what is considered to be ethical and so on. I mean, indeed, that's how many rights which are now enshrined in law became enshrined in law in the first place, a sufficiency of will and so on. But maybe you can see already where I'm leading here. What I'm suggesting, however, so there's nothing wrong with that, but there is something a little bit disingenuous when the bases of the arguments are described incorrectly. When, to repeat the point, people talk about rights rather glibly, but they're not really discussing something which has the force of rights. So I think at some level, at let's say a scholarly level, when you're reading the literature and so on, that is at least an intellectual failing. And perhaps you would agree that at a more immediate level, perhaps of more immediate interest today, at applied levels, we might consider that any sort of procedures that arise or are built upon inaccurate or poorly understood bases, in this case of what we're actually dealing with, are they rights, aren't they, is unlikely to work to anybody's long-term benefit. In other words, of course, I mean, again, this is not rocket science. I mean, if you present something as a right and then it turns out subsequently when push comes to shove that the right isn't actually there, well, that's not a happy situation. In fact, I suppose you could even invoke that old argument, couldn't you, about raising people's expectations, having them dashed, and then finding when the dust settles that things are actually worse than they were before because people have become cynical and mercenary and unlikely to... Anyway, so that's the center point of the paper. You'll be glad to know that I resisted my general temptation to come up with a really snappy title, which in this case I thought could be something like Bangor to Rights. But I resisted it, as you see. So you've been spared that, haven't you? So I'm going to talk about rights, but because most of the discussion about rights today in the literature are embedded in something larger, I felt I should say something to you about that larger something. And that larger something is simply the ecology of language, to use a term which is very popular. But ecology in the sense that, or we are meant to believe, or at least I think we ought to read into that, some sort of broad-based concern for all the social interrelationships that link language in its social sense, not language as linguistics per se, of course, with all the other facets of social life to create some particular social pattern. So I want to say something about the ecology of language. And again, just trying to tie it back in, you could say some of the contexts we've heard about today, the educational, the legal, excuse me, the workplace and so on, these are parts of social ecology. These are parts of the social network. Bourdieu would no doubt have a great deal to say about this. I've heard Bourdieu mentioned a few times already. I'm not a great fan of Bourdieu, but that's neither here nor there, and I won't mention it. The idea of ecology, of course, is a very good one, and I want to suggest from the outset that although, as I'll mention in a couple of minutes, the ecology of language is a fairly recent coinage, any people working in any aspect of the applied language study have always been interested in the ecology of language, and that's simply because, so I was having a discussion with somebody about this before, you can't really do good or interesting or thorough work in what I call roughly the social life of language unless you take into account all sorts of other aspects which are not in and of themselves language. You must look at all sorts of contexts, and not just in the contemporary sort of ecological network pattern, but also to say something about the history, to say something about the way things got to be the way they are now, and so on. So it's an absolute necessity, I think, to stress this contextualization. And so in that sense, ecology is not new. But as you'll see in a minute, I think that there are aspects of what I have sometimes actually called the new ecology that are less than ideal. An ecological sensitivity, therefore, has always been important. Careful considerations have shown that, just to put it in another way, just to remake the point, that a sort of a more nuanced attention to the social life of language has always been the sort of attention that has stood the test of time. I mention that because one of the fields that I left is social psychology and the social psychology of language. And one of the difficulties with that, perhaps you've come across it yourselves, is that it tends to be very decontextualized. Social psychology of language gives you very interesting little snapshots. And the information is usually, or I should say very often, presented in statistically very sophisticated and elaborated ways. But there's no sense of what came before, and there's very little sense, or one has very little confidence that you could use this as a prediction of what's going forward. So, anyway, so ecology first, and then I'll move more directly to rights. The first thing to say about it is most people, when they first strike this term, the ecology of language, expect something, well, not unlike what I've just mentioned, a rounded, interdisciplinary look at language in all its relationships. A concern for the historical background, and so on and so forth. But in fact, when we look at modern treatments of the ecology of language, we'll see that they are, in important ways, limited and circumscribed. Now, I should say a couple of things, just for those of you who don't know about, since I've been mentioning the history of things, about the term. The term ecology itself is not very old. It only dates to about the 1870s. It was coined, it's obviously a Greek coinage having to do with home and interrelationships and things. It was actually coined by a German guy called Haeckel, who was sort of the chief Darwinian on the continent, and he was plumping for this Darwinian idea. So I don't need to tell you then that when he talked about a sort of an ecology, a social ecology, a human ecology, he meant a sort of struggle, right, in which you had to take into account all the factors, good, bad, and indifferent. A Norwegian linguist in the early 1970s, about 100 years later, expanded the idea and said, well, you know, we could think about language as having, as being a sort of an ecology. But here's the point. Right from the beginning, this, I don't know if he actually coined it, but this popularizer of the idea of an ecology of language, he never lost sight of the fact that it was of metaphorical value. It suggested, he said, some interesting analogies between languages and the living social world of which they are a part, which includes us, of course. But not a metaphor to be pushed too far. Another scholar said, I quote, "Remember, a language is no more an ecology than a mental organ or a calculus." In other words, you know, it may be an interesting way to think about language, but as you'll see in a minute, the danger is that maybe we'll begin to think about it too much as if it was a living, breathing, on its own, I don't know, part of biology or something like that. Another difficulty which occurs to me with regards to metaphors is that even if they're very clever, metaphors by their nature tend to be terse and abbreviated statements. And they, by their nature, they selectively illuminate some things and they leave other things aside. I mean, it would almost be a contradiction in terms to have a metaphor that would cover a very wide scope of things. Anyway, so let me just say a couple of things about why this more than metaphorical extension of language ecology, to make an analogy between that and the biological world, why it isn't a good idea. Well, the answer probably has already occurred to you. Language is not an organic thing. When people talk about languages dying and when they talk about well, heavily loaded terms, language murder, language suicide, one can read about this sort of thing and so on. These are metaphors which, well, it should be remembered that they're metaphors. Languages themselves, of course, don't obey any sort of natural imperatives. The languages don't have any intrinsic quality which bear upon. There's no sort of linguistic survival of the fittest in terms of languages per se. I mean, that was a point which was only available to scholars, I'd say, in the last 150 years or so. I mean, but now it's a received part of linguistic wisdom that every language system, every dialect, is a valid system adequate for the needs of its speakers. So, although in the bad old days, people would sometimes say, well, it's somehow right that this language should fade away because intrinsically it's just not as good as another language. That just doesn't wash anymore. Or to come at it from another point of view, languages are infinitely expandable according to our needs. And there's millions of examples of that sort of thing. So when languages decay, die, or use these other loaded terms which really don't apply, we're not talking about an organic event. Languages, I suppose it is fair to say, isn't it, that languages do have a sort of a life, but it's a life, if I could use that metaphor still, it's a sort of a parasitic life. I mean, languages die if their communities of use die out. They're parasites on things which are really organic. The future, the fortunes of language are bound up with those of its users. And so if languages decline or, in quotes, die, it's because the circumstances of their speakers has altered. Now, having made that little proviso, I want to go back to the idea of why the metaphorical association of languages with the living world is so appealing. It's a linkage, after all. It's a linkage which tries to establish itself, linking between what is provided, if I could put it that way, between what is provided and what is constructed. A very useful linkage to bear in mind, particularly in a world today which, unlike earlier forms of society, is increasingly aware of environmental issues of all sorts. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why the metaphor persists. The advantages of adding anxieties, let's say, about the decline of language, to concerns with, I don't know, pollution, loss of plant habitats, industrial depredations, it seems pretty obvious. And people say, well, if we intervene to save whales, to clean up oil spills, or indeed to keep historic buildings from the wrecker's ball, to repair or preserve rare books, I mean, you can expand it as you'd like, then why should we not always, also, I beg your pardon, why should we not also try and stem language decline? Why should we not try and ensure a future for all varieties, prevent larger languages from swallowing up smaller ones, and so on? These are the sort of useful questions that a biological metaphor, I would say, quite reasonably might prompt. But some recent ecological arguments have attempted to make the link between linguistic and other types of diversity much more than metaphoric. One commentator is pointing out that areas in the world that are rich in one are also extensive in the other. That is, rich in biological diversity, lots of plants, flowers, bamboos and things, and languages on the other. Many people have felt that there may be more than analogy. And indeed, there are parts of the world where, you have loads of languages in a relatively small place, and boom, very, very lush, varied plant life. And one commentator, who I prefer not to name, said these two diversities might be mutually supportive, perhaps even co-evolved. And went on to say a little bit later, I quote, "The persistence of vigorous, thriving linguistic diversity around the world may afford us our best chance of countering biodiversity loss and keeping the planet alive and healthy." Now, if you can sell the punters on that one, you're really home free, right? I mean, we have to keep Welsh going, because if we don't, we're all going to burn up and there won't be any plants, and, the cows will go somewhere else. And I mean, and as I say, it is undoubtedly true. It's very easy to point to parts of the world. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking of Papua New Guinea. I don't know how many of you have been to Papua New Guinea. Rare experience. I haven't been there, but within a relatively small area, there's something like 1,000 distinct languages. Very, very diverse. And it's also a very rich area for biology, real biology. There are also some South Pacific islands like that. The island of Vanuatu, I actually have a couple of colleagues who work there. Another place where there's sort of tropical, tropical richness and many languages. But the problem here is that although there are such areas in the world where you find lots of this and lots of that, to put them together, to suggest some causal connection, is to make that classical error of thinking that correlation implies causation. Right? I mean, we all teach our students, or we should, that correlation doesn't imply causation. There are actually other good linking arguments as to why it is that if these two things are not, as this idiot commentator said, co-evolved, there are good reasons as to why we would find, in fact, in the same areas of the world, lots of languages and lots of plants, but it's not a causal connection. I don't have time to go into it, but I can tell you about it later if you're interested. It's a bit like storks and babies. Do you know about storks and babies? Sure you do. Well, do you know the story about the correlation between storks and babies in Denmark? Do you know that story?
Sure.
Huh?
Sure.
Oh, well, of course, sure. Well, don't tell them, because I'm going to tell them. Okay. So, somewhere in Denmark, I think, perhaps, it doesn't matter. People people noticed that at the same time as there seemed to be an unusual number of storks nesting in the area, there were lots of babies. And you could plot this mathematically, and yeah, there was a correlation between the two. Oh, so is there a causal link? Do the storks bring the babies? Maybe. Well, it could be the other way around, couldn't it? Do the babies bring the storks? A bit less likely. Well, as is often the case when you see two things related but they're not causally connected, there are other variables in the background that bring about the connection. Does anybody think what the variable in Denmark in the autumn and the early winter might have been that would produce storks and babies together? No. 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 Well, okay. It was warm chimneys. So you bring the babies home and you keep the house warmer than usual. So the chimneys are a bit warmer than usual. And storks, which are apparently very stupid birds, and nonetheless are not so stupid that they don't realize it's nicer to sit on a nest which is slightly warm. Now, I guess there must be some point where this begins to be counterproductive if you're a stork, like if you've got flames going up the chimney. But anyway, warm chimneys. So anyway, correlation, causation, you have to be careful about that. And the reason why I referred rather glibly to this idiot commentator is this is exactly the sort of error that we try and warn students about, as I say. To see somebody who's actually writing, getting published in the sociology of language literature, well, you know, it's a bit disheartening. Okay, so that's the first thing. So this ecology metaphor, which has somehow grown, and not just among, well, maybe it is just among a slightly lunatic fringe. But there are some other aspects too of ecology that I want to mention to you. So not only do we have this misguided attempt to see causal links between languages and the natural world, that initial emphasis upon ecology from its first introduction, before it even got translated to become a more specialized ecology of language, was always, as you would expect, an attempt to picture the world in all its complexity. Nice things, bad things. Well, I mean, think of survival of the fittest. Some things do well, some things don't, some things go to the wall, so on. That's the idea of an ecology. It's not particularly, certainly not in the minds of Haeckel and his colleagues, certainly not in the minds of this Norwegian linguist who extended it to ecology. It wasn't meant to, to represent any sort of picture other than a picture of competition, conflict, turmoil, and so on. But the problem, apart from this biological extension that I've mentioned, the problem in modern conceptions of ecology of language is that the idea, this broad breadth of idea, I should say, has been narrowed. It has been narrowed to the extent to which now people talk about an ecology of language in which, in a very un-Darwinian sense, there's room for all the languages. Everybody's going to get along peacefully. There are lots of examples of how this is obviously not true. I just picked one not too long ago. It was an example from the language environment in the republics of the former Soviet Union. I mean, very vicious language tactics there. Language tactics which could be described as predatory. One language, you know, sort of gobbling up or attempting to gobble up another. You could even see it in relations in Canada between Quebec and the rest. You can see it in almost every situation in which small languages rub up against larger ones. It's also very interesting in that these sort of areas in which you see a sort of, what I say, a real ecology at work, you often see a really interesting phenomenon, which, a little bit, just to digress a little bit, it was a phenomenon called dealing with minorities within minorities. This is really interesting. We've seen some examples of this in Quebec, but also in the same ex-Soviet republics, where a language which feels itself put upon, which feels itself beleaguered, you know, vis-a-vis Russian, vis-a-vis English, and so on, tries to strengthen its status. But there are smaller groups within that minority that essentially, realizing what's going on, say, oh, well, that's good, because they'll have to realize that, you know, what's good for them must also be appropriate for us. And they're always told, no, no, it doesn't work for you. It's one of the great things about nationalism is it doesn't necessarily play fair with other nationalisms. This has led to some really interesting examples with regards to language. But I mean, of course, the greatest and most obvious example of an ecology which is not fair in any sort of ethical sense is, of course, the globalization of English. I mean, where English progressively invades more and more domains around the world. I mean, it's not a process in which words like fairness necessarily first come to mind. But as I say, the much modern writing under the heading of the ecology of language is as if it puts all that aside, and I'll tell you why in a minute. It puts that aside and suggests to us that language ecology is a much more pacific, beneficent sort of arrangement. Here's another quotation from somebody who says, functioning language ecologies are nowadays characterized by predominantly mutually beneficial links and only to a small degree by competitive relationships. Metaphors of struggle of life and survival of the fittest should be replaced by the appreciation of natural kinds and their ability to coexist and cooperate. Well, of course, whenever you get statements in which words like should appear, you realize that you've departed a little bit from construction. There's no predation in that picture, right? Rather, with that, which I would call an unrealistic, inappropriate sort of limitation, we are shown a nice world in which there's room for all languages, where the goodness of diversity is a given. It made me think, when I first read it, which admittedly is some years ago, maybe some of you remember, I forget which film it was in, but it was Woody Allen's reworking of a line from Isaiah, I think it was Isaiah, in which, anyway, Woody Allen said, he said, you know, in this world, the wolf shall lie down with the lion, the lion shall lie down with the lamb, but the lamb won't get much sleep. That's the situation for many, that characterizes many language context situations these days. Now, the reason why this narrowing has occurred is because most people who now write under the heading of the ecology of language, which I've tried to say has a number of basic flaws and then is increasingly being narrowed in scope, the reason why it's taken this sort of narrowing is because almost everybody who writes under that rubric today is interested in the maintenance of diversity, is interested in the maintenance of small languages, particularly, of course, once again, in the world today where English is such a powerful, presents such powerful pressures to other languages. So where I've got to now so far is simply that we have a situation where something which is given the title of something broad and overlapping, all-inclusive, comprehensive, and so on, has actually been narrowed, and it's become something very, very specific. And I don't like that. I don't think it's fair. People are presenting something as if it were part of a larger, more general picture, but they're only actually interested, and they only actually promote, and they only actually write about one aspect of it. In this case, preservation of language diversity. Now, I know, of course, why it happens. Of course, we all know why it happens. There have always been, as I've suggested a minute ago, contests between bigger and smaller languages. The rise in the current status of English is not new in principle, not at all. But it's certainly new in terms of degree. I mean, the degree is much greater than we've ever seen before. And this has motivated a lot of people to ask a couple of questions. First of all, to comment upon just the very fact of that language spread. Why is it so unprecedented and so on? I mean, many of the answers are obvious, and if they're not, I'm not going to go into them here anyway. But the second, or the ancillary question is there intentionality behind that spread? You know. So perhaps it won't surprise you, even given as far as I've got so far, when I tell you that many of the people who write in this now sort of delimited ecology of language are more or less conspiracy theorists. I mean, you've heard the phrase linguistic imperialism, right? I mean, there are several books now, including a famous one Robert Phillipson a few years ago, Linguistic Imperialism, which sort of paints a picture in which, you know, people plot to see a language, English in this case, through the agencies of the British Council and other arms of government, actually moving out into the world. Now, I think this fails on a number of at a number of levels. Again, I don't have the time to go into it right now, but the most basic failure is at the level of, well, just invoke Occam's razor. You don't need a conspiracy theory. You know, you don't need, even if there had been nothing like a British Council. Any reasonably passing acquaintance with recent history would tell you that English, in other words, languages, unless we're talking about very draconian authoritarian situations, languages progress vis-a-vis other languages much more by unofficial pressures, much more by forced choices than they do by official edicts. I'm not saying that official edicts are unimportant, of course they're not. And besides which, you know, almost every country has had some sort of organization that tries to push its own language in the world, and so on and so forth. So there is this sense of the intentionality. And this, we haven't quite completed the picture yet, but I hope you see the lines that are emerging here. A section of the social scientific community that is concerned with linguistic diversity, that has taken language ecology and molded it to their own purposes, whose purpose is not a disinterested observation of what's going on vis-a-vis language contact, but a much more committed, could I say, scholar activist or scholar advocate position on behalf of some particular language or another. Now again, I have to immediately insert, if it's not obvious, that there's absolutely nothing wrong at all with promoting language diversity. You see where I'm going here with this. I mean, like most educated people, I would prefer, you know, a linguistically diverse world to live in than a sort of monochromatic one. But that's not the point here. The point is the difficulty with, first of all, acting and writing in a somewhat disingenuous way, and then, as I say, this rather fraught combination of scholarship and activism or advocacy. And the particular part of the literature and the particular sort of people who are interesting themselves in these questions fall very much into that category. So I'm going to just skip over this, but essentially the new ecology takes linguistic diversity to be an unalloyed good, to be defended wherever it's seen to falter. It makes arguments along a number of grounds: moral, scientific, economic, aesthetic. I'm not going to say much about the scientific or economic. We've heard some today. These things can be argued back and forth according to circumstance, whether the preservation of linguistic diversity in a particular area is going to be good or bad for scientific development, for progress, for economic advancement, and so on. The aesthetic one at the end, the fourth one I mentioned there, because many people do have quite powerful emotional attachments to one language or another, after all. Many people will tell you that, you know, one language is better in some sense than another, not on the purely linguistic terms which I mentioned at the beginning, which have now been outlawed. But I mean, there was, I should say, a small but interesting part of the scholarly literature going back to the 1920s, which argued that, well, maybe languages don't prosper or fail to prosper because of their any inherent linguistic qualities or faults. But damn it all, some just sound better than others, and civilized people, these are more civilized sounds, and so on and so forth. I mean, again, you'll be happy to know, if you don't know already, that there is a little scientific literature to deal with that as well. And one of the things you do is, maybe I'll just make a little digression here. You, as a friend of mine who actually came from Cardiff himself, but now he decamped to America, did some studies years and years ago. It simply involves presenting examples of languages, or even better, varieties of languages on tape to people who don't know those languages or dialects, and asking them simply to say on aesthetic terms which one sounds nicer. And so in one study, he did a number of these studies, and embroideries on the theme, but in one study he took two varieties of Greek, Athenian and Cretan Greek. Now, it's probably pretty easy to guess that for members of the Greek-speaking community, the Athenian dialect is the high-status one, and all the positive stereotypes accrue to its speakers. They're more intelligent, they're ambitious, they have cuter children, I don't know. It goes on and on. And the Cretan variety is spoken by hicks in the backwoods, and all. So easy to just trigger these stereotypes. I mean, I've done it lots of times too. Anyway, so you take an example of each of these, you record it, making suitable adjustments for making sure the things are comparable. I won't bore you with the details, and you play it to people who, again, if I was going to try and inflict something nasty on you, I would say, for whom it's Greek to them. But I didn't. And you find that not only, in more than one study, not only did people who were just asked to say which one sounds pleasant, not only did they not regularly pick the Athenian one, which of course be at the top of the tree within the Greek community, but if anything, there was a slight bias to like the Cretan variety. So you've got to chuck out that aesthetic argument as well. No, the one I'm really interested in here, and the one which really counts for the ecology of language, and I am finally closing to the language rights part of the thing, is the moral case. The moral case has a number of thrusts, but I'll just mention two here. The first is that loss of diversity and language attrition, language shrinkage, means loss of accumulated wisdom, information, cultural transmission is interrupted. Something is lost which cannot be regained. And I'm not going to go into that too much, although, like all interesting questions, it's contentious. I mean, you could say, well, maybe that's a more serious argument if you're talking about languages and cultures that don't have a written form. I mean, that's an argument. Again, there are counter-arguments even there, but that's an argument. So you might say, well, maybe it's a good thing then for a variety which is under pressure to, or it would be lucky if it's a variety that does have a written form, that it does have a standardized orthography and so on. And if it doesn't, maybe it'd be a good thing for its survival if it developed one. Even today, people are out in various parts of the world producing dictionaries and grammars and so on for societies which didn't have them. But if that's the case, then here's another interesting little frisson from the language ecology group, and that is there are people in that group who've argued against providing literacy and orthographic regularity to groups that don't have them on the grounds that it will somehow upset their primeval sort of authenticity. And besides which, they say, if a group all of a sudden becomes literate in its own language, why, it's only a short step before it starts reading stuff from other languages, and you've just accelerated the process of, could I say, linguistic predation, as other languages come in, and it'll even be easier, sort of a Trojan horse. Well, I mean, that's a funny sort of argument, isn't it? Anyway, so that's the one thrust of the moral argument that I mentioned here. But the other one, of course, is this question of language rights. And of course, I've already anticipated my conclusion. I've already pointed out to you that a lot of what's written under the heading of language rights is in fact no such thing, at least if you reckon rights to be something that have some enforceable or justiciable sense to them. But nonetheless, the literature is full of this. There are organizations, language organizations, that have issued charters, declarations, and other things, many of them vaguely modeled on UN charters and so on. Certainly a number of foundations for endangered languages and other similarly named bodies. I'll give you a couple of examples of the sorts of things that they write. Deciding which language to use and for what purposes is a basic human right. TESOL, that's a big outfit in America, teachers of English to speakers of other languages, TESOL. They passed a resolution in 2000 advocating, I quote, all groups of people have the right to maintain their native language, a right to retain and use it. And the other side of the coin, they added, I quote again, the governments and the people of all countries have a special obligation to affirm, respect and support the retention, enhancement and use of indigenous and immigrant heritage languages. There are a number of problems here. I'll mention two. One of them is that these declarations, just like indeed the famous 1948 declaration, the UN Declaration of Human Rights and most other ones since, tend not to be very specific about language, and there are lots of political reasons why member countries wouldn't like that. And many of the recommendations are just that. They are not enforceable. They suggest to countries what countries ought to do vis-a-vis indigenous and sometimes immigrant populations. But they imply duties, but they don't always accompany them. There are no enforceable obligations in many ways. This is also true for European conventions like the Charter for Regional Languages and so on. Many countries have ratified it, not all. But even the countries that have ratified it, that is to say protection of languages in there, don't necessarily do much more than give lip service to this. There's another problem too, beyond that, and that is, again, as I was mentioning to somebody I think earlier today, it's one thing to legislate rights for you to use your language. And there are lots of instances where this has been done, in part in this country, certainly in Quebec, where there was a sufficiency of population and general will to have very many specific things about French enshrined in law. You'll know about the sign law, you'll know perhaps about the necessity for people who come to Quebec to put their children in the French school system and not in the English school system. I mean, these are real rights and obligations which are, enforceable. In Ireland, where I used to work, I mean, everybody had a right to communicate with at least some parts of the civil service in Irish and to expect reply in Irish. It was at one time necessary, formally necessary, to get a pass in Irish at secondary school before you got your overall leaving cert. That was something which I think backfired quite badly against the language. But anyway, the point is you can legislate that sort of thing if you have a sufficiency of will and political desire. It was rather more difficult to legislate rights to be understood. Unless, of course, you're dealing with, as I just gave you that little example, of some aspect of the Irish civil service where you do have a right to be understood. That is to say, you do have a right that your letter or telephone call will be responded to by somebody who's competent in Irish. But in general, in the larger world, in the unofficial world, where so many of these things actually have their real life, it's very difficult to legislate rights to be understood. So you can see I'm suggesting that a right for you to speak a particular language is not necessarily going to do you an awful lot of good if there's really very little opportunity for you to use it. I've already mentioned another aspect, and that is there are some problems, again, since most of the interesting contemporary discussions of language rights have greatly benefited in the last few years from the entry of political philosophers into the argument. That's because they've raised many of the arguments for, however generally they might have been framed, were really outbreaks of special pleading for one particular group or another. But now we have, I'm happy to say, 2 or 3 prominent Canadian political philosophers, but other people, philosophers going back to Rawls and so on, who try to sort of raise the level of the argument and talk about under what conditions language rights might be reasonable. And one of the first things with which they have to grapple is, again, something I mentioned in passing, and that is in historical liberalism interprets rights as being connected to individuals. And some of these modern arguments say, well, but does that apply to all rights? I mean, you might have certain rights as an individual which can be understood at an individual level, but surely they say language rights at an individual level, it doesn't really compute. I mean, language rights have to have some groupness built into them, if only for the reason I just mentioned. Well, I mean, I'll give you a particular example. In Canada, a political philosopher called Kimlicka has written a great deal about the necessity of providing certain language rights, others too, but language rights, to particular groups and not to others. He's tried to tread this tricky path that he hopes will allow him to maintain what he considers to be the basis of liberal principles, liberal democratic principles, and at the same time bring in something other than the individual. For example, I'll give you a specific example. He argues that some language rights should be accorded to indigenous minorities, which are not necessarily to be held out to immigrant minorities. Again, there are lots of problems. I mean, I'm not giving any remedies in this paper. I'm just simply mapping out some of the difficulties, I suppose. One of the problems is that how long do you have to be in a place before you get to be indigenous? Or what happens when all the large numbers of, for example, in Toronto now, more than 50% of all the kids who come to school come from homes where neither French nor English is the first language. And all these people are now citizens, or almost all of them. Well, I mean, are they just to say, well, I guess we haven't been here long enough, another generation or two, then we'll start asking for stuff? That's not how they look at it. It's not how they look at it. There are other people who claim, again, getting a little bit back to this minorities within minorities business, who claim that paying attention to group rights is not always a very good thing. You may remember that in 1995 there was a referendum in Canada as to whether Quebec should go it alone, and so on. And a great deal of damage was done in all sorts of ways. But one of the things that looked sort of positive was that after that particular French-English dust had settled, people did seem to come together and say, you know, one of the things we should do, we should pay more attention to the Aboriginal communities in this country, the First Nations, as we call them now, to their languages, to their cultures, to say nothing of their material living conditions, poverty and so on. And they began to talk about the application of this idea of group rights, so that if you're a member of an Indigenous First Nation, you should have certain things, certain rights, certain privileges, which other people wouldn't. And in the middle of this discussion, so to speak, a group within the Indigenous community, Indigenous, First Nations, Aboriginal women, put their hand up and said, excuse me, we would like to have the old traditional historical rights in here in the individual principle, please. We don't like this idea of greater rights being given to us as members of this particular First Nation group. Why? Because they said it's already patriarchal enough. We would take a roll of the dice. We would take our chances on rights inhering in individuals. Just a particular example of what a tricky area all this is. If in fact I needed to tell you that. Even more basic is, again, getting back to something I highlighted at the beginning, is the question of the very existence of language rights. Some people have maintained that there are lots of cultural claims, but until these claims make their way into law, it is inaccurate, and some people would say more than inaccurate, to call them rights. And here I've got a lot more that I could say about modern philosophers weighing in on this, but I'll just remind you of a philosopher who I think is worth looking at again now and again, and that is Jeremy Bentham. Now, if any of you know about Jeremy Bentham, you probably think of him as the utilitarian guy. You remember the greatest good for the greatest number, and he even, I think he was a bit of a wacko actually. I mean, he even had what he called a felicific calculus, by which you could somehow almost quasi-mathematically determine the outcome that provided the greatest units of happiness, as opposed to, and that's the way you should go, and so on. But he had some interesting ideas about human rights in general, which apply to language rights. Of course, he was writing, he was writing, it didn't get published till some time later, but he was writing and thinking at the time of the French Revolution, and they were issuing declarations of the rights of man. You remember, there were two main ones, I think, maybe others. And of course, everybody on this side of the channel was scared stiff about what that meant and so on. Plus, they saw how the French Revolution had dissolved into, yeah, okay, you get the idea. So he really got engaged with this idea of rights and I guess you could say they're abuses. But he knew that, just as these modern ecologists of language know, that if you can sort of get away with talking about rights without being too inconveniently challenged, you're onto a good thing, because rights, the word has a powerful appeal. I mean, if I say you have a right to something, I mean, that implies, he said, when you have said that a man has a right, well, you should insist upon it. It is a plain case then. All proof is needless. The business is settled in a trice by the help of a convenient word or two, and without the pains of thinking. Now, I would say, to linking Bentham with some of these modern people, I would say that to link a quite particular argument, or to suggest that a quite particular argument is the only one open to enlightened thought, that's an ideological statement. That's not a scholarly one. Because when enforced, it shuts down intellectual debate. Isn't that so? I mean, it's a bit like you're having some argument with somebody and finally it veers onto the tricky ground of religion, and you or the other one could say, well, I'm sorry, hey, listen, that's what I believe. Well, there's no more rational traction after that. I mean, you know. So Bentham, I'm of course summarizing terrifically here, but Bentham is essentially suggesting that rights, the language of rights can take on that degree of power and seem unchallengeable. And if you do challenge them, well, you're obviously some unenlightened primitive. I mean, who could possibly, you know, well, the words of the American Constitution, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. If something is self-evident, you don't have to prove it. You don't have to prove it. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know, they cribbed it from John Locke. But with one little change. John Locke had written life, liberty, and property. But, of course, that doesn't sound so well in a constitution. Pursuit of happiness. Of course, they don't guarantee happiness, no. They guarantee you to have a go at it. It's not quite the same thing. Anyway, Bentham thought that self-evident human rights were illusory. He said the term natural right, which was common usage in his day, was actually a perversion of language. He was a wonderfully blunt writer. The only real rights, he said, are those created by law, which means that the idea of natural rights is, I quote, nonsense. And if you add the addition of what he called imprescriptibility, that is, they can't be taken away, they become, in his famous phrase, nonsense on stilts. Well, you've got to love a guy like that. Extra legal rights, he said, are at best, I mean, this goes right back to my beginning, are at best hopes for rights, or we could say claims. But desires and aspirations for rights are not the same thing as rights. The best thing, this is not Bentham himself, I have to admit, this is a commentator on Bentham, but he's speaking about Bentham. He said, the best that might be said regarding a statement about natural law or natural rights, that was the currency a couple of hundred years ago, was that it amounted to an expression of opinion, right you are, on the part of a speaker, that such a right or such a law ought to exist. Well, there's another one of those funny words, isn't it? Like should. If you read should and ought, it's, I can drag in another philosopher here, Hume. You may remember there's something called Hume's law, or sometimes Hume's guillotine, which says it's illegal, illogical to go from statements of what ought or should to be to statements of what is or are. Anyway, that such a right ought to exist. In other words, the statement was a moral claim ambiguously expressed. For Bentham, specific legal rights, which were often correlated with specific duties and obligations, are desirable and will, he said, be enshrined in law to the extent to which they contribute to, there's that sort of word again, the general mass of felicity. Again, he's assuming some degree of, well, what he thought to be democracy at the time anyway. Otherwise, he said, they should be abandoned. And here's the final quote from Bentham. Right, he said, is the child of law. From real laws come real rights, but from imaginary laws, from laws of nature fancied and invented by poets, rhetoricians, dealers in moral and intellectual poisons, and I could chuck in there modern writers on the ecology of language. From these come imaginary rights, a bastard brood of monsters, he says. And my final concluding sentence is simply this, a very simple one. For language, or for any other rights for that matter, to have a palpable existence, one that extends beyond the wishes of advocates and activists and so on, some sort of legislative teeth are required. Without those, at least two things follow. First, nothing of enforceable or enduring significance can really be predicted. And second, as I think I touched on before, expectations that are unlikely to be met may be raised, most poignantly perhaps in groups who very often, let's face it, groups we're talking about with endangered languages and so on, they're very often groups who have very real ongoing material difficulties, physical difficulties. You're adding to those, you're raising expectations among groups who already have, real day-to-day problems and so on. Difficulties extending well beyond threats to language continuity. So really all I've tried to do is, well, to put it this way, I hope that whatever you think of the talk, you might think it reasonable to inquire a little bit further when you read some of these breathless claims about, ecology of language, language rights, and so on. And because, as I say, I think they are very unfortunately tossed about. But I do want to end by just reminding you that none of this should be taken as any sort of personal reflection of how I feel about linguistic diversity. That's not on the table at all. I feel I have to mention this because sometimes people are unwilling or perhaps unable to distinguish a critical stance from a hostile one. This is not a hostile stance. I mean, I have no particular horse in many of these races. I am very interested in all the races. And I'm interested as a social scientist to try and approach things in as disinterested a way as I can, knowing, of course, that nobody is completely value-free, etc., etc. Anyway, so that's it. I just hope I've laid out a few things that may be of general interest. Thanks very much. Thanks.
Right, we have some time for questions.
I've thoroughly enjoyed. You've thrown out so much, actually, but it's
Sorry?
difficult. You've thrown out so much in that lecture that one is deciding to decide what to grab onto. But
Thank you.
because you've grabbed on, you've made the point about rights, the loose use of the word right, something which we are familiar with in Wales, and what you're saying is actually very timely and very appropriate, because there are, in the name of political sleight of hand, we do often encounter people claiming that certain things do grant rights which, as you said, do not grant rights in any legal, actionable sense at all.
Yes.
One is reminded, listening to you, of Oxley, theorists like Wesley Hofeld, who tried to produce a model which identified the interrelationship between a right, a difference between that and a freedom, two very different things, and how real rights do create obligations.
Yes.
And this is what I want to say, really, in this context, is that if we really have language rights in Wales, that will carry obligations for the whole community, including those who do not speak the language. If you give the Welsh speaker real rights, as you say, that carries obligations, in my view. Because the problem we have at the moment is this kind of idea that it's just simply all about choice. It's about you want to speak Welsh, I want to speak English. We all exercise our choices liberally and without any interference on the other, whereas that is not the case. My view is that if we do really have real language rights in Wales, we need to also be honest about the implications of those rights for everybody. What is required? Same with disability rights, same with gender rights, they carry obligations to those of us who are not disabled or who are not part of that particular section of the community. And those are the thoughts that came rushing to my head as you were talking. I just thought what you thought of some of
No,
those.
I think that's right. I mean, again, it's an old liberal principle that rights often involve duties or obligations. You could say that one of the obligations, if we lived in a slightly more utopian society, would lie precisely on the part of speakers who weren't given extra rights, if I could put it that way, or given rights to speak their ancestral variety, to actually fill that gap that I mentioned, that is the right to be understood. There would be more places. And I mean, you could say in some cases this is increasing, largely first through official channels, but largely in some parts of the world where more and more of the majority mainstream speakers are themselves, or at least putting their children to learn the other language. So that's a possibility. Another angle that appears to me, though, is that many people would say, well, Welsh people already have exactly the same obligations as other, as non-Welsh speakers do, because these are obligations which come with just a general citizenship. So what extra would we expect from the Welsh-speaking community if we were to, here, we give you extra language rights, now here's something extra you have to do in return. And I don't think that really captures exactly the essence of the issue in most cases, because if you think about most cases that involve arguments about language rights, about people who, some of whom at least would say they had been unfairly, historically deprived of rights, that amends needed to be made, that some redress in some sense. We're not really asking about these newly given rights, newly seized rights in some case, to be accompanied by obligations. They're almost a compensatory mechanism. They're almost as if they're making up for lack of full engagement earlier on. And you think about many of the classic areas in the world today where there are struggles going on between larger and smaller languages, and where the language of rights is invoked. It's largely a question of you have to restore our rights, which were unfairly suppressed or ignored. We've already been under all sorts of unfair obligations. This is just a question of leveling the playing field. I don't know quite how to put it, sort of in legal terms, but it's almost as if there is a retrospective burden of obligations which has to be lightened, and will be once the linguistic balance has been brought back more into some sort of equilibrium. So it is a classic principle, of course, that rights and duties go together, rights and responsibilities, all these terms that we understand, but it doesn't always map easily onto many of these situations for the reason I've just mentioned.
I was interested in that, the right to be understood being difficult to enforce, but once you give a language right, say in Wales, if you contact a public body, you have a right to be understood if you speak Welsh.
Mm-hmm.
That is enshrined in law. I don't think there's a reciprocal right if you contact a body in English to be. It isn't. I don't think it's enshrined in law. Somebody might know differently. You might know differently. Is it enshrined in law that you can be?
Well, society creates the environment whereby the right to English can exist. The simple illustration of that is that English is a compulsory subject for every child. If he comes from a Welsh-speaking home, that child will speak English by the time he is 11 years of age. That is absolutely. So all Welsh speakers will have performed their civic duty to learn English.
Yeah.
Therefore, will obviously be able to honour the rights of the English speaker.
So de facto,
that's de facto.
Right.
But whether it's well, you can tell me, or somebody can tell me, is English actually inscribed anywhere in UK or any subsidiary part of legislation as being this is the official language? No.
No.
Nor it is. People are very surprised to learn that that's also the case in the States. English is not the official language of the United States. There is nowhere that says this is the official language of the United States. English has been made official at various state levels, increasingly over the last few years, largely, I have to say, because of fears about Spanish. But, and so the situation does become a de facto, but an incredibly powerful and obvious de facto one. And that must surely be the case here.
Yeah, at the same time, if you create a Welsh language commissioner that in theory is at the beck and call of people who feel that their language rights as Welsh speaker have been infringed,
yes.
There is no parallel body for English speakers who feel that their rights have been infringed.
Well, I dare say they would be if enough people felt that way. Such a body would be created. I wouldn't hold my breath, though, would you? I think it's unlikely. And but beyond that, do you really think it would be necessary, given this very powerful de facto situation?
Well, it could be. It could be.
Possibly.
In isolated areas of Wales.
Yeah. Well, then you would come back to a variant of the group rights versus individual rights thing. I mean, because another problem that bedevils languages in contact with other languages are regional disparities and differential regional treatments. I mean, in Ireland, for example, there were attempts made to sustain, enhance, and encourage Irish speaking in the Irish speaking areas, but it created a sort of artificial fishbowl almost existence, besides which people who lived in similarly dire straits as the Irish speakers in the Gaeltacht, but had the misfortune to live just on the wrong side of the boundary, they didn't get this extra bit of government largesse. I mean, it's tricky. Or I mean, to turn the thing on its head, I mean, what minority language wouldn't like to be in the position of the Basques or the Catalans, where you have a very powerful industrial homeland, where their problems are very often weakened by people coming from outside, speaking Castilian, and diluting the Catalan or the Basque society. Sorry, there was a hand here, I think.
I'm going to say it in Welsh, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Explain myself a bit.
Just give me a minute to turn this on. Okay.
Dwi jyst isio ymateb mewn ffordd i'r gwybod hefyd fan yn dweud, a mynd yn ôl i'r pwynt sy'n dweud am y retrospective leveling of the field, lle, achos dyna'r addas sydd yn digwydd yng Nghymru fel rhywun sydd yn gweithredu ar y safona iaith newydd sydd wedi bod yn rhoi hawl, os ydych chi'n darllen y safona, mae ei gyd yn gwneud efo yr Cymru Cymraeg yn gorfod gofyn. Maen nhw wedi i gwiro o blaen y di-Gymraeg. Yr un sydd ddim yn siarad Cymraeg yn syth. Felly, does am pwynt deud bod angen yr un math o hawl ar gyfer y di-Gymraeg, achos mae yna'n ddi-ofyn. Yr unig beth mae hawl y safona wneud ydy roed yr hawl i chi ofyn amdano fo. Beth sy'n ddifyr oeddech chi sôn amdano y geiriau right and claim yn Saesneg, ond yn Gymraeg, fysa ni'n defnyddio'r un gair i'r rai beth, hawl a hawlio. Felly, does am llawer o wahaniaeth yn y Gymraeg rhwng y ddau yna. Un pwynt arall ydy, da ni fod yn siarad amdan strategaeth mwy na geiriau Llywodraeth Cymru sydd yn gwneud efo maes iechyd. A dwi'n teimlo mae nhw wedi mynd gan ymhellach o'r strategaeth honno a wedi mynd ar ôl yr angen iaith yn hytrach na yr hawl yma. Felly bod ni'n ymateb i angen y defnyddwyr yn hytrach na bod rhywun yn gorfod gofyn gwranda bod yna fwy o ystyried o beth sydd wedi angen a beth yw'r peth gorau i'r derbynydd gwasanaeth.
Well, I agree, first, on the second point first, I do agree, of course. I mean, the question of rights need never come up if nobody brings it up. If everybody, or more or less everybody, agrees here is a need and we have the wherewithal to satisfy that need, well, it's a non-issue. But rights are an issue in many arguments, and when it comes to language, for the obvious reason that if you do have a right to something and it is enshrined in some sort of law, well, you're on much firmer ground. There are teeth to it. Your first point, I mean, I find it difficult to think that there is no way in Welsh of distinguishing between something which is a claim and something which is a right. You may need more than one word to do it. You know. Well, yes, it is interesting, and there are lots of similar examples that that don't map well onto other languages as well. But I mean, I would find it a very strange community that wasn't able to make that distinction. Yeah. Yeah, sure, of course, yes, certainly.
I mean, mae'n drafodaeth yma, chydig bach yn athronyddol, falle bod e'n brydych chi bod fi'n dwch. Ond, yn yr hyn oeddech chi'n deud i gynharach, oeddech chi dreulio peth amser yn sôn am yr ecoleg yma, a y cyfyngiadau sydd i'r defnydd o'r syniad o'r ecoleg. Ond os nes i ddeall yn iawn, yr un elfen oeddech chi yn cydnabod, oedd yr elfen yma o disgrifio ecoleg iaith o leia'n cydnabod y gystadleuaeth sydd yna. A mae'n y gystadleuaeth naturiol rhwng ieithoedd. Os ydyn ni'n derbyn bod hynny'n wir, ai sefydlu hawliau yw'r unig ymateb I iaith leiafrifol? Neu oes yna ymateb arall I iaith leiafrifol? Pan maen nhw'n amlwg yn colli allan yn y gystadleuaeth na sydd de facto yn golygu bod rhywun ddim hyd yn oed yn gorfod gofyn am rhywbeth yn Saesneg, achos mae jyst yna. So oes yna ymateb arall heblaw hawliau, achos weithiau mae rhywun yn edrych ar pethau fatha y safonau iaith a meddwl, wel, mae hwn yn amrwd iawn ac yn wan iawn yn rhai achosion lle mae rhywun yn gofyn. A mae rhywun yn teimlo, ond nid oes rhyw ymateb arall yn hytrach na jyst dod nôl yn erbyn hawliau.
Yeah, well, there are lots. I mean, we just heard one. I mean, where if everybody agrees that there is a need and it's not a contentious one, then you don't need to delve into this tricky sort of legal or quasi-legal swamp. I mean, the classic adaptation is, of course, a permanent, semi-permanent, a permanent bilingualism or diglossia, where there continues to be realms for both languages which large numbers of people accept. And diglossia, of course, is simply the Greek version of bilingualism. In itself, it doesn't have any different connotation, but in actual fact, it has the connotation of some sort of permanence in which two, or I suppose you could have triglossia as well, but you know, where two languages coexist for a long time, jogging along, each with its own particular domains. But there are a couple of problems there too. One is that when the languages are of unequal status, you can predict which language community is going to be more bilingual than the other one. So it's seen as an unfair relationship. And the other has to do with this the sort of predatory nature of linguistic contact that I mentioned before, and that is that one language increasingly nibbles away at the domains. I mean, Fishman, who somebody had on the board before, who was my own thesis supervisor, by the way, hundreds of years ago, always used to say, well, you know, things are tough for small languages, but as long as the language maintains itself in the home and the hearth, you know, then there's always a future for it, which is true as far as it goes. But, you know, he neglected to point out that every once in a while that language has to get up and go out the garden gate and engage with the, you know, you can't stay at your mother's knee forever or by the fireside, you know, toasting muffins. And so that's a problem. And so one language constantly nibbles away at another. And again, of course, the perfect case in point is English, progressively taking more and more domains. It's an interesting thing, which I didn't have time to go into, and it's actually a separate little question, but it's a very interesting one because it turns out not to be a random process. You know, that is, when one language is increasingly encroaching on the other, even beginning to insert itself in the domains that first smaller language felt were still its, public manifestations tend to go first. Public interactions tend to go first. Private domains remain the longest. And that's pretty obvious, isn't it? I mean, you may not be able to use your language in public or at work anymore. You may even have trouble having your kids schooled in it, but you can still speak it at home if you want. I mean, there's that degree of intimacy. And I had a really interesting example. I think I mentioned it in one of the other talks, which I didn't realize the importance of at the time, the social importance. As I was doing some work on French-English bilingualism in the States, and it was a French Catholic community, and many of the elderly people were either monolingual or almost monolingual in French. And the main parish priest in this particular part of the community anyway was also a native Francophone. Well, one day, some group of these elderly Francophone parishioners went to the priest and said, could they begin making their confessions in English? Now, these were people who were much more capable in French than in English, some, as I say, almost monolingual. The parish priest, I think, was pretty bilingual, but he was still a native Francophone. They all felt more comfortable in Francophone. You know, they'd be making their confessions in French for all the time. So what does it mean? What does it tell you about how they thought about themselves? That they were, if you like, letting English into, I mean, what could be a more private domain than the confessional? I mean, the language police are, you know, it's one of the last places they're going to come knocking on the door, right? And yet they, of their own volition, You know, you see what I'm saying with this? It told you something about how they thought about themselves. I mean, the specific was, it told you something about how they felt about themselves vis-a-vis their cousins and relations who'd stayed north of the border in Quebec and hadn't come south to sample the American dream. That's what it told you. But as I say, it didn't really hit me until later. I realized that's very significant. And as I say, it illustrated the general point that when languages are sort of eating away at other languages, they do so in a progressive way.
Okay. Thanks again, John. That was really
Thanks, Dave.